The hospital room was ordinary, aggressively so. Beige walls, a vinyl recliner, the scent of antiseptic fighting a losing battle against wilting flowers, but the view was worth $1 billion. From the window on the 11th floor, Central Park sprawled below, a perfect rectangle of impossible green. The lungs of a city that never slept. For 20 years, this was her world. Not the 42-room apartment 3 blocks south. Not the sprawling Connecticut estate. Not the Santa Barbara Palace perched above the Pacific. Just this room. Her name was Huguette Clark, and when she checked in for a minor skin condition, she brought with her a fortune built on copper, railroads, and the very marrow of the American Gilded Age. She was supposed to stay for a weekend. She never left. For 2 decades, she paid the hospital an estimated $1 million a year to be a resident, not a patient. Her mansions, perfectly maintained by a silent army of caretakers, stood empty, frozen in time. A 1950s kitchen with appliances never used, closets filled with couture gowns never worn. And in a custom-built room, a city of dolls, intricate French figures living out the lives she never did. When she died at 10, the world awoke to a ghost story. A woman worth over $300 million had vanished in plain sight, choosing the sterile anonymity of a hospital bed over a life of unimaginable luxury. Why? Why would an heiress to one of America's greatest fortunes lock herself away, trading marble halls for linoleum floors? Was she a tragic recluse, a prisoner of her own wealth, or was she the sanest one of all? A woman who saw the gilded cage for what it was and chose, deliberately and methodically, to disappear. Good evening, my friends. I see you've found your way back to the quiet corners of history, to the spaces where the ink has faded and the whispers have just begun. If this is your first time joining our circle, pull up a chair. You might want to subscribe, because tonight we are not just telling a story. We are unlocking a door that has been sealed for a century, and behind it lies the enigma of Huguette Clark. To understand the woman who died in that hospital room, we must travel back to a time before the silence, before the locked doors, to the very moment her story began, not with a whimper, but with the clatter of carriage wheels on the rain-slicked cobblestones of Paris. More than 100 years ago, it is June 9, 1906. The air in Paris is thick with the scent of coal, smoke and damp earth. This is the twilight of the Belle Epoque, a fragile, glittering moment of peace before the world tears itself apart. In a lavishly appointed apartment, a child is born. Her name is Huguette. She is the daughter of William Andrews Clark, a man who clawed a fortune from the copper mines of Montana and bent the American West to his will. He is 67 years old. His hair is a shock of white. His eyes hold the cold glint of a man who has seen the bottom of mines and the top of society and found them equally wanting. He is a titan, a tycoon, a United States senator whose seat was famously bought, not won. They called him a robber baron, a predator in a bespoke suit. He was a man who built a railroad just to spite a rival, who founded a city in the desert and named it after his family, Las Vegas. And now, in an age when most men are contemplating their legacy, he holds a new one in his arms. She is a creature of impossible delicacy, a footnote in the epic saga of his life. Her mother, Anna Eugenia LaChapelle, is a woman of quiet beauty and startling youth. Nearly 40 years his junior, theirs was a story whispered about in the salons of Paris and the drawing rooms of New York. He had been her guardian. She became his wife. A secret marriage, a secret child. Huguette's older sister, Undre, had been born for years prior under a veil of secrecy. Now Huguette's arrival is another piece of the puzzle. Another life begun in the shadow of a colossal, controversial man. This Parisian room is a bubble of tranquility in a restless world. Nurses glide like ghosts on polished floors. Servants murmur in hushed French. Outside, The city hums with the energy of a new century. The Eiffel Tower, once a monstrous curiosity, now pierces the sky with confident grace. Automobiles, loud and monstrous, share the streets with horse-drawn fury. Picasso is setting the art world on fire. Einstein is rewriting the laws of the universe. The great wars are gathering like storm clouds on a distant horizon. But inside, the only sound is the ticking of a gilded clock and the soft, rhythmic patter of rain against glass. This child knows nothing of the empire that awaits her across the ocean. She does not know that her father's name is synonymous with a level of wealth that borders on the obscene, a fortune that rivals the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts. She does not know that he has built a house on Fifth Avenue in New York so large, so opulent, so aggressively grand, that it makes the palaces of European royalty look quaint. It has 121 rooms, a Turkish bath, a private art gallery filled with masters, and a dining room that can seat 100 guests. It is a monument to ego, a fortress of fortune built to scream his arrival to the old money aristocrats, who sneered at the rough-hewn miner from Montana. This is the world Huguette is born into, not a family, but a dynasty. A world of marble and velvet, of servants and secrets, of immense privilege and even greater isolation. Perhaps the silence she would later crave was born here, in these quiet, elegant rooms where her father was more of a legend than a parent, and her mother more of a beautiful, distant portrait than a caregiver. In 1911, the world glitters for a moment, a final, brilliant flash of pre-war pageantry. 5-year-old Huguette, a small, serious child with copper-colored hair, finds herself in London. The city is drowning in pomp and circumstance for the coronation of King George V. She would have seen the gilded carriages, the plumed helmets of the royal guard, the endless river of silk and jewels. To a child, it would have been a living fairy tale, but it was also a lesson in the performance of power, in the rigid ceremony of the elite. She learned to stand still, to be seen and not heard, to be an accessory to the grandeur around her. This was the language of her class, a language of appearances, of unspoken rules and vast, empty spaces between people. Soon, the family would leave the soft, gray light of Paris behind for good. America was calling, not the wild, raw America where her father had forged his empire, but the stratified, unforgiving society of New York. They sailed across the Atlantic, the endless gray water a buffer between two worlds. Huguette, now a young girl, would have stood on the deck, wrapped in wool against the salty spray, watching the old world recede and the new world rise from the horizon. The destination was not a home. It was a declaration of war. The Clark Mansion at 965th Avenue, on the corner of 77th Street, was an act of architectural aggression. It took 6 years and $7 million to build, an astronomical sum at the turn of the century. It was a French chateau, a medieval fortress, and a Roman temple all rolled into one, consuming an entire city block. New Yorkers, accustomed to the excesses of the wealthy, were stunned. They nicknamed it Clark's Folly. It was simply too much. Inside, it was a labyrinth of impossible scale. A grand staircase of pure marble swept upwards into the gloom. A 2-story art gallery housed a collection that would make a museum director weep. Works by Rubens, Botticelli, Donatello. There was an organ room, a conservatory, a private chapel. The family's private quarters were on the upper floors, but the house was not designed for family life. It was designed to overwhelm, to intimidate, to announce that William A. Clark, the man from the mud and copper of Montana, had not just arrived. He had conquered. For young Huguette and her sister Andrée, this palace was their playground. Imagine it. 2 small girls, their footsteps echoing in halls built for giants. They would have played hide-and-seek among priceless statues, whispered secrets in rooms draped with ancient tapestries, and slid down banisters carved from exotic woods. Their world was both limitless and suffocating. They were surrounded by beauty, but it was a cold, museum-quality beauty. The house was filled with objects, but not with warmth. Laughter was a fragile sound, quickly swallowed by the high ceilings and heavy velvet drapes. Her father, the architect of this world, was a spectral presence. Now in his 70s, he moved through the house like a living monument, a man from another century. His first family, children from his first wife, were grown, with children and grandchildren of their own. They were strangers to Huguette, ghosts from a past she did not share. This new family, with his young wife and 2 small daughters, was his final act, his attempt at a different kind of immortality. But he was a man of commerce and conflict, not of bedtime stories and gentle affection. Kindness was a transaction, and his time was a commodity more valuable than copper. Her mother, Anna, navigated this opulent prison with practiced grace. She hosted the grand gatherings, the musicales and dinners where the city's powerful came to pay their respects. On those nights, the house would come alive. Light would spill from the tall windows onto Fifth Avenue. The sound of string quartets and thin, brittle laughter would drift into the cold night air. Huguette would watch from the top of the stairs, a small, silent observer, peering through the carved balustrades. At the glittering spectacle below, she saw the performance of society, the exchange of pleasantries that masked ruthless ambition, the shimmer of diamonds on women who appraised each other like livestock. She learned that wealth was a costume, and power was a game played with quiet words and knowing glances. Then, when the last carriage pulled away, the silence would descend again, heavier and more profound than before. The house would return to its slumber, a stone and marble beast, dreaming of its own importance. Her closest companion was her sister, Undri. 4 years older, Undri was the light in the shadows, the laughter in the long corridors. They were a world of 2, a secret society in the heart of the mansion. They shared tutors, they played with their dolls in the vast nursery. They whispered dreams in the dark. In a house designed for display, their bond was the only thing that felt real. The only thing that wasn't for sale. Education was another part of the performance. Huguette was enrolled at Miss Spence's School for Girls, an institution designed to polish the daughters of the elite into perfect society wives. She learned French, piano, art history. She learned how to pour tea, how to make polite conversation, how to curtsy. But her real education was happening within the walls of Clark's Folly. She was learning about solitude. She was learning that one could be surrounded by everything and feel nothing. She was learning that the most valuable things, love, connection, intimacy, were not listed in her father's ledgers. She developed a passion for art, not just observing it, but creating it. She loved to paint. In a world of rigid order, it was a space where she could exert control, where she could create beauty that was hers alone. She also developed a deep, abiding love for dolls. They were not mere playthings. They were companions, subjects in a world she could manage. She would spend hours arranging them, creating intricate stories and lives for them. Lives filled with the warmth and connection that her own often lacked. This was not a quirk of childhood. It was the beginning of a lifelong obsession, a clue to the landscape of her inner world, outside the iron gates of the mansion. The world was hurtling forward. The roaring 20s were on the horizon. Jazz was spilling out of Harlem. The stock market was soaring to dizzying heights. And the frantic energy of a new, modern America was changing the very rhythm of the city. But inside 965th Avenue, time stood still. The house was a relic of a bygone era, a Gilded Age, fortress holding out against the relentless tide of the 20th century. William A. Clark, the old titan, was failing. The man who had wrestled with mountains was now wrestling with his own mortality. In 1919, when Huguette was just 13, tragedy struck, a blow so swift and cruel it would forever alter the geography of her heart. Her sister Undri died of meningitis. She was just 16. The laughter in the great house was extinguished. The world of two was shattered. For Hugh, the silence that had always been a feature of her life now became a crushing, overwhelming presence. The vast mansion, once a playground, was now a mausoleum, a 121-room tomb echoing with the memory of a lost companion. Her father, already old and remote, retreated further. Her mother was consumed by a grief that had no words. Huguette was left utterly alone, a solitary child in a palace of shadows, left to navigate the labyrinth of her own sorrow. The death of her sister was the first lock, turning in a door that would one day seal her off from the world. It was the moment the quiet, observant girl began to understand a terrible truth, that everything, no matter how beautiful or precious, could be taken away in an instant. She learned to hold things loosely, to love from a distance, because the pain of loss was too great a price to pay. A few years later, in 1925, the old king died. William A. Clark passed away at the age of 86. The newspapers were filled with obituaries detailing his colossal fortune and controversial career. The Copper Empire passed into history. And Huguette, now a young woman of 19, inherited a fortune that was almost impossible to comprehend. Along with her mother, she was now one of the wealthiest women in America. The world was at her feet. Society columns buzzed with speculation. Who was this mysterious, beautiful heiress, hidden away in the great Clark mansion? Suitors would surely line up, desperate for a chance at such a prize. They expected her to emerge, to take her place in the glittering circles she was born to inhabit. They expected a debut, a grand marriage, a life lived in the public eye. They were wrong. The death of her father and the inheritance of his fortune did not liberate her. It imprisoned her further. The weight of the Clark name, the fortune built on grit and scandal, was now hers to carry. And all she wanted to do was disappear. The great mansion on Fifth Avenue, Clark's Folly, became her gilded cage. The world waited for Huguette Clark to make her grand entrance. Instead, she began, slowly and deliberately, to vanish. The erasing of the past in 1927. She and her mother made a shocking decision. They had the mansion torn down. New Yorkers watched in disbelief as the wrecking ball smashed into the granite and marble, dismantling the grandest private residence the city had ever seen. It was a public act of erasure, a declaration that she would not live in her father's shadow. They moved into a new, impossibly large apartment on the 12th floor of a new building at 9 Fifth Avenue, overlooking the very same corner where the mansion had stood. It had 42 rooms. It was still a palace, but it was a palace of her own choosing. A fortress with a better view. The false start. For a brief moment, it seemed as though she might step into the light. In 1928, she announced her engagement to William Gower, a law student and the son of one of her father's associates. There was a wedding. Society breathed a sigh of relief. The heiress was following the script. But the marriage was a phantom. It lasted less than 2 years. The divorce was quiet, discreet, and final. The final retreat. And with that, Huguette Clark retreated for good. The doors to the 40-term apartment closed, and they would rarely open again. She did not emerge. She did not remarry. She did not attend the parties or the charity balls. She simply stopped. The world outside continued to turn. The stock market crashed. The Great Depression choked the country. World War II engulfed the globe. And through it all, Huguette remained in her apartment, a ghost in her own life. She painted. She collected her dolls, commissioning custom-made clothes and houses for them. Creating a miniature world that was perfect and predictable, she communicated with the outside world, primarily through letters and telephone calls, her voice a disembodied presence. Managing a vast financial empire, she had no interest in seeing firsthand. Years turned into decades. The staff at 907 Fifth Avenue knew her only as a set of instructions. a whisper behind a closed door. They would leave food, collect laundry, and never lay eyes on their employer. She was living a life of extreme, almost pathological, privacy. Then, in the late 1980s, when she was well into her 80s, a series of small health crises led her to that hospital room with the billion-dollar view, and she found, in its sterile, anonymous embrace, the perfect solitude. Here, she was safe. Here, no one could get to her. She could look out at the world, at the changing seasons in Central Park, without having to be a part of it. She had finally perfected the art of disappearance. She had turned her life into the ultimate locked room mystery, and she had taken the key with her. When the last page of her life was turned, and the world finally peered inside her empty homes, they found treasures. Monet paintings, a rare Stradivarius violin, a doll collection worth millions. But the real treasure, her story, was still a mystery. Was it the crushing weight of her father's legacy? The devastating loss of her sister? The suffocating expectations of a society she wanted no part of? Or was it something simpler? Perhaps, in a world that demanded so much from a woman with her name and fortune, the only true luxury was the freedom to say no. The freedom to close the door, to draw the curtains, and to live life on her own, quiet, solitary terms. The mystery of Huguette Clark is not just about a wealthy recluse. It's a story about the shadows that vast fortunes can cast, and the quiet, human desire for a life of one's own, even if that life is lived within the four beige walls of a hospital room. The questions still linger in the air, as potent and unsettling as the dust motes dancing in her abandoned mansions. What secrets were locked away with her? If you, like me, find yourself drawn to these shadowed corners of history, to the stories that whisper from behind closed doors, then I invite you to join our circle. Subscribe, and together we will continue to seek out the lives that have been forgotten, to piece together the puzzles that time has left behind. Because sometimes, the quietest lives are the ones that have the most to tell us.